views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have a show today dedicated to two different topics, guns and an interesting topic regarding blockchain and any type of issues regarding currency in the digital era. It's an interesting show with multiple guests. So stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We are pleased to have returning with us today, Congressman Adriano Espaillat. Congressman, how are you doing today?
Thank you. Very well. Very well. Thank you for having me once again.
Oh, we always love having you on. So there's been shootings, always shootings, unfortunately, throughout our country and as well as our city. And I know you have been at the forefront in terms of trying to rein in certainly the gun lobby and some tough laws with respect to guns. Maybe we could start off talking a little bit about the concept of ghost guns and what they are and what you think should be done with respect to ghost guns.
Well, ghost guns are assembled. They come in a kit and they could be shipped to your house. They don't have a serial number. You can assemble them yourself, and at the end of the day, you walk around with a 9mm that hasn't gone through a background check, FBI check, or doesn't have a serial number. And so this is something that should be regulated. And so my Ghost Guns bill holds the Ghost Guns kit to the same accountability, strong accountability and regulation that other guns should be held to.
Okay, so let's say I'm a bad guy, right? And I decided I wanted to have a gun. I don't know whether it's through Amazon or whatever I do. I start getting a little bit of parts and pieces together: the handle, the place to aim, some bullets. Well, how do you regulate that? What do you do to prevent the parts from coming from different places?
No, the frame should have a serial number, and the manufacturer should be regulated. And any parts that's sold to any individual should go through a background check, a very strenuous background check. And if you don't, then you're breaking the law. It's as simple as that, right? We can't sort of like give the bad guys the ability to circumvent the law, and we still got to strengthen the law. You know, we're working on doing away with the Charleston's loophole, and also to making sure that background checks are provided for folks that are unregulated sellers of guns in gun shows or in other venues that currently circumvent the traditional background check apparatus, if you may, right? And so there should not be a way to get around that. And of course, ghost guns are sort of like, unfortunately, part of the future. And we should regulate them right now. And that means that any part that's sent to someone, via mail or otherwise, that seller, that manufacturer must be held to having a background check for that person that's purchasing.
Are you receiving any pushback either from the NRA or from the usual gun groups? Don't take away my guns. Where's the pushback coming from, and how are you dealing?
The NRA continues to push back, but this Ghost Guns bill, recently President Biden put out an executive order, but we should still go ahead and pass the legislation and codify it. So it's currently part of a bigger bill that we're doing that's introduced by Congresswoman Demings from Florida, who was a former police chief of Orlando, Florida. It's HR 3299. And one of the key provisions of that greater bill is codifying the ghost guns bill, so that it's not just an executive order that could in the future be done away with by any other president.
Assault rifles, assault guns, the use of these particular weapons in such a way that they're not used as they're intended to be used. That could be either through braces on your arm, so you can hold it in such a way that you can almost use it as an assault. What can we do to limit the ability of people to get these types of guns and alter them in such a way that they make them into almost like weapons of war?
Well, I'm against carrying those weapons altogether. I think that the framers of the Constitution were not thinking of assault weapons when they were framing the Constitution. They weren't thinking of an AK-47 or a semi-automatic weapon that's really a weapon of war for the military. There is no space nor use for those types of weapons in civil society. And so I'm against it altogether from the start. And of course, there are ways that we could limit their usage. But I think that once we do that, we begin to accommodate the concept that you can go into a rally, as we've seen, with an AK-47 on your shoulder. And I don't think that America should be. We just saw how this past May 26th, there was a shooting in San Jose, California. And unfortunately, they continue to occur. Guns are running rapid and fast in New York City. Shootings are increasing dramatically. Last year, we had a 97% increase in shootings. We were like at 2005, I believe it was, numbers. This year, we're going at even at a faster pace than last year. So it seems as though we're heading back to the 80s and 90s, and that's not where we want to go. And
well, why do you think that is? Why is the gun violence more prevalent now in our city? You're right; it was there in the 70s when I was living in Queens, and it's it's tapered down. What's bringing this back?
Well, look, first, I think there's the access to guns. It's a problem, right? This powder trail coming from the southern states that allow weapons, particularly handguns. David, we often don't speak about handguns because when you see a horrific shooting with a semi-automatic, weapon, it's so horrendous that it catches our full attention, and we sort of like take our focus out of the more prevalent cases of handguns in urban corners, right? And I think having access to these handguns is a problem. So the background check, strengthening the background check is so important. Getting rid of the Charleston loophole that would allow the FBI additional time to do extensive background checks is so important. But just having greater control of this powder trail coming from the southern states, from the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia. So we're concerned about that access to guns. So the laws are very strong on the books. If you get caught with an illegal weapon, you're going to do some time.
Sure.
But accessing those weapons seems to be readily accessible particularly to young people in urban areas. So I am concerned about cutting that powder trail from southern states up to New York City and other urban sites across America. That results in shootings and killings of often very young people. So I'm very concerned about that. We need to do more about prevention. Providing for young people greater opportunities is so important to addressing this issue. This is not just about law enforcement. This is also about providing those services that are needed in the urban setting where young people are at every day. This is going to be a hot summer, right after the pandemic. People are venturing out of their apartments. I'm scared that this will be a very hot and violent summer. We must step out and step up in making sure that we provide great opportunities for young people, summer youth jobs. Let's open up the schools during the summer months and provide with them a setting that will stray them away from that corner and that violent act.
Well, we certainly can talk about this all day, but unfortunately we're out of time. Congressman, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on as
Thank
usual.
you.
And of course, we hopefully will see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me once again.
It's always our pleasure. Okay, stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. Welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host, David Lesch. We have joining us today, Professor of Law, Adam Winkler. Adam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
It's our pleasure. Guns, gun policies. It's all over the news. It's always in the news because there's always a shooting, and then within a month there's always going to be a shooting, and it's unfortunate. And one of the reasons we have you on is to really talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going, at least from a legal perspective. And maybe you could just start us off as to the Second Amendment and why that was so important way back when, but maybe not now.
Well, sure. I mean, the Second Amendment of the Constitution provides that a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. It's almost as if Madison, the author of this provision, had just discovered the comma and wanted to put it in there as many times as possible. And the result is that it's kind of confused generations of Americans. What exactly does the Second Amendment mean? For the founders, it was primarily about militias, as it says right there in the amendment. They were afraid that the federal government might disarm state militias, and at a time when state militias were really essential for the security of a state. They didn't have standing armies, they didn't have a National Guard, they didn't have a police force. And so those militias were really important to the framers. Over time, however, gun technology changed, and the militias changed too. We don't really have militias in the same way we once did, and guns have become much more useful for personal self-defense. And over the last 200 years, Americans have reconceptualized or reconceived the purposes of the Second Amendment away from militias and more towards a personal right to have a firearm in case of confrontation. This idea of the Second Amendment as a personal right to have a firearm for personal protection was affirmed by the Supreme Court in a 2008 Supreme Court case called District of Columbia against Heller. It was the first time the Supreme Court said unambiguously that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms and struck down a gun control law, in that case, a ban on handguns in Washington, D.C. And Heller has led to a whole wave of lawsuits since, challenging any number of laws as unconstitutional under the Second Amendment.
Well, I guess now that we're moving, into a situation where there are mass shootings, and the guns seem to be reformulated in such a way that they're either more powerful, or they're not even using just handguns. They end up with really basically assault rifles. Where are we going with respect to those types of cases and limiting the ability of homeowners to use those types of weapons for protection?
Certainly one of the top items in the gun control movement's agenda today is to outlaw or to restrict the sale of these military-styled rifles that are called assault rifles, and also to restrict high-capacity magazines that can hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition. Where we're going on this, frankly, I don't think we're going that far. I don't see that there's any real prospect for federal regulation of either of these two items. The Republican Party is certainly dead set against any new gun restrictions, especially these. And it seems hard to imagine how you get 60 votes in the Senate as long as Republican opposition is that strong. So I don't think those laws are going to be adopted at the federal level. We have seen in recent years at the state level, some states, just a handful of them really, but some adopting restrictions on these kinds of weapons. I think one of the big challenges for those states is that I think the Supreme Court, because of the 3 nominees that Donald Trump appointed to the court, who are all likely to have very strong pro-gun views of the Second Amendment, I think that those states that have bans on military-style rifles and high-capacity magazines really run the risk right now of having those laws overturned by the Supreme Court.
You would think both sides would have some type of agreement on the background checks. I can't see why either would, especially Democrats, but certainly, maybe Republicans, why they would have any type of opposition to making sure that those who should not possess the gun because of some type of mental illness or mental disease do? How or what any type of pushback with respect to background checks?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. I think one, I think some people worry that background checks will be used to create a national database of gun owners, and gun owners and gun rights advocates fear that a database would be used one day to seize their weapons. So there's a fear of a national gun registry. There's also concern that people have that some people would be unwittingly violating the law. If they had a gun and went on a hunting trip with a friend and they let the friend borrow their gun for the hunting trip, well, that might run afoul of a requirement that you go through a background check before you transfer possession of a weapon to any other person. So there are some concerns that people have raised about these issues. I don't think that they're insurmountable in terms of legislation. However, the gun politics today are such that it's unlikely we're going to see that kind of compromise and reasonableness. Too many people, especially on the right, fear that any support of a gun law will be used against them in the next election.
Well, listen, I'm sitting in New York, so maybe it's different from my perception, but it looks like the NRA is losing a little bit in terms of their steam. Do you find that to be the sense nationally, or is it just that I happen to be in a blue state?
There is no question that the NRA itself as an organization is really struggling right now. The New York Attorney General is pursuing a lawsuit that's seeking to put the NRA out of business for financial mismanagement and internal corruption. The NRA tried to avoid the New York Attorney General's prosecution by filing for bankruptcy and reorganization in Texas. The bankruptcy judge, however, rejected that effort, in part because the court said that the court saw increasing incompetence and mismanagement at the NRA, including on whether to file the bankruptcy filing. So there's no doubt that the NRA as an organization is really under a lot of pressure and is really struggling financially, organizationally, and otherwise. We should not, however, take the leap and to suggest that because the NRA is struggling, that the gun rights movement in America is struggling. There's a big difference between the two. And even without the NRA, there's a lot of elected officials out there who strongly believe in gun rights or are strongly concerned that their constituents want them to vibrantly protect gun rights. And I don't think the NRA's downfall will have a significant effect, at least in the short term, on America's gun debate.
Well, Professor, I'm just going to have you look about 10 years in the future, if it's possible. You're looking at a crystal ball. Where is the biggest inroad going to be? Assault rifle, ability to walk around with a concealed handgun. Where do you see the biggest, infringement on the gun holder's rights?
Well, certainly I should preface anything by saying, tea leaves are best left for making tea, not for reading the future. And I'm not particularly skilled at reading the future, but I think if we look in the future, I think what we can see is that it seems very likely that we're going to see the Supreme Court expand gun rights under the Second Amendment and strike down at least some laws that regulate guns today, whether that's military-style assault rifles bans or high-capacity magazines bans, or the Supreme Court has already agreed to hear a case next year dealing with New York's restrictions on concealed carry. It seems very possible that the court will say that the heavy restrictions on concealed carry permitting in New York and Los Angeles and Boston and other major cities is unconstitutional, and people have to be allowed to, if they're law-abiding, to carry guns on the streets. So that would be my big prediction, that we're going to see the Supreme Court get more involved and make it harder for the gun safety movement to enact and defend gun restrictions. I don't see that we're likely to see any federal movement in terms of new federal legislation. It just seems like the partisan divide is very, very bitter on so many issues, and guns are certainly not the issue that's going to bring them back together and find compromise. We'll probably see some diversion at the state level. Some states, red states, making their laws looser. We're seeing a lot of states move towards permitless concealed carry. You don't even need a permit to carry a gun. That's been a wave in the red states, and we're seeing in blue states more restrictive gun laws, like restrictions on high-capacity magazines, red flag laws, and things like that. So what we see in the future is a lot of movement in a lot of different directions, but none of which point to really solving America's gun violence problem.
That's unfortunate. Well, it's an area of the law that I'm sure is going to continue to develop for years to come. Professor, we want to thank you for being on and for informing our viewers, and hopefully you'll come back soon.
Would love to do it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. Welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host, David Lesch. We have a guest with us today, Max Dilendorf. Very interesting topic, by the way. And I'll let Max tell you a little bit about it. Max, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. David, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's an honor to be here today.
It's our pleasure. You know, I don't get too many topics that I'm not familiar with in the law field, and this is certainly one of them. So we would love to have your expertise. The initials NFT. What does that even stand for, Max?
NFT stands for non-fungible tokens. It's a token that's supposed to be unique and verifiable by public on a network called blockchain.
All right, so we're talking virtual stuff at this point, right? Not something I'm literally holding in my hand.
Everything is digital. Yep, it's digital as it gets.
All right, so let me throw out like a scenario for you, and you tell me how this works out. All right, so I'm in some virtual world, right? Let's say my son is in Roblox or whatever, and he wants to buy piece of art that's on the wall, or he wants to buy something inside the virtual world. Is that somehow related to these NFTs, or is it something you're buying while you're in the world? Make me understand.
Yes. So the world that you mentioned, let's say digital world, it's one big NFT. But before we get there, let me give you an example from the real world, so that our listeners and watchers understand what this really is and how it works. So let's say you, David, you buy a piece of land in Brooklyn, right? And the ownership of that land would be represented by a title, and the title is recorded with Department of Financial Services. So anyone can look it up who owns this physical piece of land, right? You cannot have two owners to the same deed. So the same concept is true with NFTs. When you create a piece of digital art or digital land, by creating NFT and recording it on a blockchain, you are able to confirm to the world that you are the true owner of this digital piece of land or an art, right? Just to give you an example, let's say you take a picture on your phone. You take a picture, right? And you send it to your friend, your family friends, your wife, your son. And so everyone has a copy of this picture that you took. But the question is, who really owns it?
But would the person who took the picture own it? Let's say I took a picture of you right now. I take a picture of you with my phone. I take a picture of it. And now I got you on my laptop while we're talking. I have a picture of you. Who owns that? Me, you, both of us? Who owns that?
Well, that's a good question. So how would a third party verify that you are the true owner of that picture, right? So by creating this digital art and wrapping it around the smart contract and recording it on a blockchain and thereby creating NFT, a third party can verify that David, you are the true owner of this digital piece of art, right? So the same concept is true when you're buying a piece of land or a piece of art in a digital world. There was a digital world called Decentraland where people buy and sell very expensive digital items. So last month, someone purchased a $250,000 piece of land in a digital world.
That's incredible.
Right? It's incredible. And this is where it's slowly moving. So we see companies like major publicly traded companies.
So let me ask you a question. So let's say my son, he's playing Minecraft, right? But it's not Minecraft. He creates his own little world in another app that he manages. And he builds a hotel and he builds a pool and he builds all this stuff, which he does. And then somebody else wants to come in and take a swim or walk around. He can register what he built as his own digital property, like title, correct?
That's right.
And who does that? Do Does a law firm like your law firm do that? How does that work?
Well, it's still day zero in this exciting industry, but
Okay.
ultimately the same type of legal considerations would arise in the digital world, right? How do you register an ownership to this piece of land or digital art? What contractual representations does the seller or buyer of this piece of digital art make? What are the tax consequences? How does a seller stay compliant with federal and state KYC and anti-money laundering regulations, right? So the legal framework that we have in the physical world, it would also apply to the digital world, right?
Well, let me ask you a question. So who regulates this? Does the federal government, the state government, FTC, IRS? So who's determining, you know, who can decide who owns what?
David, and I love this topic, right? It's because right now it is a wild west, but technically multiple federal and state agencies have jurisdiction over NFTs and anything digital, right? So namely, US Department of Treasury, FinCEN, IRS, Securities and Exchange Commission, CFTC, and 49 states regulating money transmission have jurisdiction over these products and digital world. So when someone tells me that we are buying, selling, creating, trading NFTs, in my mind, there's so many questions like, how do you do it? How do you know that you stay compliant with all these federal rules? And therefore, I'm saying right now, it is a wild west. Seamless payment.
So how does your firm help with this? Like, what can you do? Like, what is your role really?
My role will involve compliance and guiding clients through federal and state frameworks,
which is always changing, which I assume is a constant changing of the laws, or at least, you know, it's something that someone in your field would definitely need to know as almost like the immigration laws. You know, it's always an evolving, changing area. Certainly, I would think.
It is, but at the same time, there is a foundation that doesn't change. So to give you an example, if you, David, and we both have a presence in the digital world, right? And we make a transaction. Let's say I am purchasing from you a very expensive piece of land, right? Following the federal guidelines and Bank Secrecy Act and Anti-Money Laundering Act, I would need to know who you are, David, in the physical world, right? I would need to check your identity in the physical world. I would need to know that our transaction is compliant. I would need to know that the funds will not be used for any illicit activities or terrorists. So the same framework would apply in the digital world, right? Second, what if the sale of land could potentially be viewed as an investment contract or a securities, right?
So you could be hired for that as well. I get it. So, well, it's, you know, it's funny. It's, you know, because unfortunately we don't have too much time. We're basically finished, but the topic is so fascinating because it's so evolving that we'd love to have you come back and maybe give us a little bit of an update in the next couple of months, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Today's verdict. Stay with us. We'll be back with more. Stay with us.
Thank you, David.
Okay, well, that's all we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, and of course, you, the viewers, for watching. If you have a topic or an issue you'd like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. Until the next time, know your issues, know the law, reach a verdict. See you in 2 weeks.